Before words left their mouths, the ancients stopped, not out of hesitation, but out of reverence. They understood what we've forgotten, that speech is not cheap, that it costs clarity, integrity, and often peace. They didn't speak to fill silence. They didn't rush to defend themselves. They didn't rehearse cleverness to impress. They waited, they listened, not just to others, but to themselves. Because the Stoic knew that the most dangerous voice is the one that speaks before thinking, and the one who cannot master his tongue cannot master his life. In our world, people talk endlessly. We speak before we process. We respond before we reflect. We react. We perform. We believe that speed means intelligence, that loudness means leadership, that cleverness means truth. But the ancients practiced something different. They practiced restraint. Marcus Aurelius ruled the most powerful empire on earth, but he spent more time writing to himself than speaking to others. In his meditations, he reminded himself again and again, speak little, speak only what is true. Speak only when silence would be worse, because every word shapes the soul. Seneca wrote that we should think more than we speak, and when we do speak, it should be with clarity, calm, and control. He warned against the mindless chatter of crowds, the kind of talking that drains energy and inflates ego. Words are not harmless, they are habits. What you say becomes what you think, and what you think becomes who you are. So before the Stoics spoke, they examined, why do I want to say this? Does it serve truth or just my ego? Will it build or destroy? Is silence more aligned with virtue than this sentence? They didn't call this weakness. They called it discipline, because silence is not absence, it's space. It's the moment where impulse is interrupted, where noise is filtered, where the self gets a chance to intervene before the ego takes over. The Stoics knew that control over the tongue is harder than control over armies, that the one who can pause before speaking possesses a kind of power that cannot be taken away. So they trained for it, daily, not just through books, but through silence itself, sitting, watching, noticing how often the urge to speak rises from discomfort, from fear, from the need to be seen or validated. Epictetus said, "Nature gave man one tongue but two ears, so we may listen twice as much as we speak. And yet we invert it. We speak constantly and rarely listen to others or to ourselves." The Stoics flipped the pattern. They waited. They thought they spoke last, if at all, and when they did speak, their words landed, because they weren't trying to impress. They weren't trying to dominate. They were trying to align with nature, with reason, with inner peace. So what did the ancients do before they spoke? They asked better questions. They sought inner stillness. They remembered that speech, once released, cannot be taken back. And they chose their words as a sculptor chooses his chisel, carefully and with intent. You don't need to say more, you need to mean more. And to mean more, you must first pause. You must let silence shape your next sentence. Because until your words come from within, not from reaction, not from fear, not from pride, they will never be yours. That's where the ancients began, with stillness, with self-governance, with quiet power that spoke only when it must. The temptation to speak quickly is everywhere. In a world obsessed with reaction, to pause is to risk being misunderstood. To stay silent is to risk losing control of the room. And yet, what if that's exactly where power begins? The ancients didn't just measure their words, they studied the source of them. They asked not only, "What should I say?" but "Where is this urge to speak coming from?" And if the answer was pride, insecurity, fear, or ego, they waited, because they believed the tongue is a mirror of the mind. If your speech is scattered, your mind is scattered. If your words are rooted, so are you. Most people today confuse loudness with authority, but Stoics understood. The more noise you make, the more you reveal about your own instability. Words spoken in haste often betray a lack of inner foundation, and once you speak without grounding, you can't take it back. You've handed over a piece of yourself to the moment, and that moment often doesn't deserve it. So they practiced a kind of inner observation. Seneca asked himself daily whether he had spoken more than necessary, whether his speech brought him closer to virtue or further from it. He believed that conversation could elevate the soul or corrupt it, and he treated his own speech with the same weight as his actions. Marcus Aurelius went even further. He reminded himself that opinions, even correct ones, could become traps if delivered with arrogance. That truth, when not paired with restraint, becomes just another form of ego. They knew that every conversation carries a subtle choice. Are you here to understand or to be seen? And that difference is everything. Most people today speak to perform, to control how others see them, to broadcast identity. But the Stoics spoke only when necessary and never to prove themselves. Because identity, to them, wasn't built through speech. It was built in silence, in the decisions no one saw, in the restraint no one praised. Epictetus warned his students not to talk too much about philosophy, not to quote Stoicism constantly, but to live it quietly, and to let their character speak before their mouth did, because the truest signal of wisdom is behavior, not volume. This didn't make them distant, it made them clear. Their silence wasn't avoidance, it was rootedness. They weren't afraid to speak, they simply didn't need to, and that's what separated them. When you speak less, what you do say matters more. When you stop rushing to fill the space, your presence begins to speak for you. The Stoics believed that words should serve virtue, not vanity, that speech should be as clean as your conscience, and that every unnecessary word was a tiny betrayal of your clarity. So they trained themselves again and again to return to quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they knew that the best words come from still water, not from turbulent waves. In your life, ask yourself, do your words carry weight, or are they just noise trying to prove you exist? Because what you say can either shape the moment or scatter it. The ancients chose the first, and they began by saying nothing at all. There is a strength that speaks without volume, a presence that arrives before words. The ancients cultivated that presence not by saying more, but by needing less. Before they entered a room, they had already spoken inwardly. Before they answered a question, they had already considered its weight. And before they offered advice, they had already lived it. This was their preparation, not performance, but purification. Because to them, speech wasn't just sound, it was alignment with self, with reason, with nature. When Marcus Aurelius writes to himself, it's not self-praise, it's rehearsal. For moments where the impulse to speak would rise fast, hot, and full of pride. He knew that when emotion takes the lead, wisdom falls silent, and he wasn't willing to trade wisdom for the fleeting thrill of a well-delivered jab. Modern life doesn't reward that kind of pause. It rewards speed, wit, applause, but that's not where real peace comes from. Real peace comes from being able to sit with a moment, unrushed, unthreatened, unhooked by the need to dominate it. The Stoics were warriors of the mind. Their battlefield wasn't noise, it was silence. And their victories were small and invisible, a word withheld, an insult ignored, a reaction swallowed. Because each time you choose stillness over speed, presence over performance, you reclaim a piece of yourself. The ancients weren't afraid of speaking, but they were cautious. They knew that once words left the mouth, they couldn't be pulled back. They could heal or harm, build or destroy, strengthen or scatter, and that made speech sacred. They didn't ask, "Will this sound smart?" They asked, "Will this make me proud when I'm alone?" And in that question is everything. We live in a world where we are told to speak our minds, to make ourselves heard. But few ask whether the mind is worth unleashing in that moment, whether silence might be the braver thing, whether not saying anything might leave more space for truth to arise on its own. The Stoics understood the difference between control and composure. Control is needing the last word. Composure is knowing you don't need it. Control is flooding the conversation. Composure is choosing not to enter it at all. You don't gain respect by dominating noise. You gain it by holding space inside yourself, space that doesn't collapse under pressure. And that space is built slowly, in private, with practice. That's why the ancients were quiet, not because they had nothing to say, but because they had already heard themselves, and they didn't need the world's noise to confirm their worth. In a world that speaks without thinking, a single moment of grounded silence is power, and the one who can pause in that space becomes the one others begin to listen to, not because they shout, but because when they do speak, it comes from somewhere real. So what does this look like today, now, in your life? It's the moment you feel the sting of insult and say nothing. It's the conversation where everyone's speaking over each other and you don't. It's the comment section, the argument, the meeting, where your silence carries more clarity than your words ever could. It's not repression, it's restraint. It's not about being passive, it's about being principled. Because the Stoics didn't teach silence as a rule, they taught it as a tool, a filter, a form of inner governance. They believed that if your words didn't pass through your values, they shouldn't pass through your lips. We forget that in modern life. We speak because we feel slighted, triggered, unseen. We speak because silence feels empty, when in truth it's full. Full of tension, full of awareness, full of insight waiting to emerge if we just stop performing and start listening. To ourselves, before they spoke, the ancients reflected. They observed the urge, they measured the moment. They asked what needed to be said, not what wanted to be said. And sometimes the answer was, nothing. That's not weakness, that's wisdom in motion. It's easy to run the mouth, easy to say what feels good, what gets a reaction, what asserts control. But the Stoics weren't trying to control anyone. They were trying to master themselves in every moment, especially the difficult ones. That's what made their silence powerful, because it wasn't emptiness, it was readiness. Readiness to speak with clarity, not confusion, with purpose, not pressure, with intention, not insecurity. And that readiness was built in stillness, night after night, day after day, word by word withheld. So when they did speak, people listened, not because of volume, but because of weight. Their words had gravity, not because they were ancient, but because they were earned through reflection, through discipline, through silence. You want to be heard? Then speak less. Watch more, slow down, let the room breathe before you fill it. And when you finally open your mouth, let it be something that's passed through fire, something shaped by stillness, something your future self won't have to apologize for. That's what the ancients did before they spoke. And it's what you can begin doing now, not later, not when you're more ready. Now, because every moment is offering you the same choice they had: react or reflect, speak or listen, rush or return. And if you choose what they chose, not once, but daily, the world may never notice, but you will, and your silence will begin to speak for you, louder than words ever could.